A man once tried to fix China so completely that he broke it. His name was Wang Mang. He looked at an empire full of inequality, debt, land problems, powerful families, angry farmers, and political decay. Then he said, basically, I can repair this. And then he started changing everything: land, money, slavery, government titles, markets, prices, taxes, coins, names, more names. So many names. So many names. If a problem existed, Wang Mang wanted a policy for it. If a policy existed, he wanted a more ancient-sounding version of it. If a coin existed, he wanted several new coins to confuse everyone equally. This is the story of the Qin dynasty. A dynasty so short that history almost sounds like it blinked and missed it. Wang Mang ruled from 9 AD to 23 AD, 14 years. That is not long for a dynasty. That is barely enough time for a government reform to finish making everyone miserable. And yet Wang Mang became one of the most fascinating figures in Chinese history. Was he a visionary reformer, a usurper, a Confucian idealist, a bureaucratic control freak, a man trying to restore ancient virtue with paperwork and panic? Yes, probably all of that. To understand him, we need to start with the Han dynasty. By Wang Mang's time, the Western Han was old and tired. The imperial family had problems. Powerful relatives of empresses had become extremely influential. Rich families owned more and more land. Poor farmers struggled. Debt was painful. The gap between the powerful and the ordinary was growing. When a dynasty gets old, it often develops the same symptoms as an old house: cracks in the walls, leaks in the roof, strange noises at night. Everyone says it is fine because fixing it would be expensive. Wang Mang came from a powerful family connected to the imperial court. At first, he built a reputation for humility, virtue, and Confucian moral seriousness. That matters. He did not present himself as a wild rebel with a sword. He presented himself as the responsible adult in the room. The man who respected ancient sages. The man who cared about proper ritual. The man who seemed modest, disciplined, and pure. In other words, exactly the kind of person who makes everyone nervous once he starts getting real power. Step by step, Wang Mang rose. He became regent. He controlled the court. He placed himself at the center of politics. Then, in 9 AD, he took the throne and founded a new dynasty called Qin. Qin means new, a bold name. Very confident. Also historically dangerous, because if you name your dynasty new, people will notice when it immediately becomes a mess. Wang Mang believed the old system was broken, and to be fair, many things were broken. Land inequality was real. Powerful families were a real problem. Poor farmers were suffering. The Han court had been weakened by palace politics and elite competition. Wang Mang was not wrong to see problems. His problem was that he tried to fix society like a man rearranging furniture during an earthquake. First came land reform. Wang Mang wanted to limit private landholding and return to an idealized ancient system. He announced that land would be called the King's Fields. In theory, this would stop rich families from swallowing everything and give ordinary people more security. That sounds noble. It also sounds like something rich landowners would hate with every bone in their expensive bodies, and they did. The reform was difficult to enforce. Local elites resisted. Officials were confused. Farmers did not suddenly receive a magical fair society. The state announced a grand moral solution, but reality replied with paperwork, evasion, anger, and local power. Then came slavery reform. Wang Mang tried to restrict the buying and selling of slaves. Again, the idea had moral logic. Again, enforcement was messy. A government can announce virtue in the capital, but someone still has to make it work in counties, villages, markets, and households. That someone is usually a tired local official with bad roads, angry elites, missing records, and no desire to become the villain in everyone else. That's life. Then came money. Oh, the money. Wang Mang changed the currency system again and again. He introduced new coins and denominations. Some were shaped differently. Some had unusual values. The system became complicated. People did not trust it. Counterfeiting grew. Trade suffered. Imagine going to buy a chicken and the seller says, "Sorry, I no longer accept yesterday's government. Approved ancient virtue coin. Please use the new morality knife." shaped coin, unless the official rate changed this morning. That is not a stable economy. That is a board game designed by a tax department. Wang Mang also tried price controls and state management of markets. He wanted the government to regulate key goods and stop exploitation. Again, the dream was order. The result was often confusion. Markets are annoying because they contain people. People react. They hide goods. They avoid rules. They bribe officials. They create black markets. They wait for the policy to fail. A ruler can write a beautiful rule. The world can answer with a smirk. This is the pattern of Wang Mang's reign. He saw real problems. He gave enormous answers. The answers looked moral, ancient, and grand. But the state did not have the trust, capacity, or stability to make them work. So each reform created new friction. Each new rule required more enforcement. Each enforcement created more resentment. Each resentment made the next reform harder. It was like trying to untangle a knot by tying 10 more knots around it for historical authenticity. Then nature joined the discussion. The Yellow River changed course. Flooding and disasters struck. Agriculture suffered. People were displaced. Food became harder to secure. When a government is already struggling, natural disaster does not politely wait outside. It kicks the door in. For ordinary people, the question was not whether Wang Mang's reforms sounded morally elegant. The question was whether they could eat. Could they keep land? Could they pay taxes? Could they use money? That still meant something. Could they survive the next official order? Increasingly, the answer was no. Rebellions began to spread. One of the most famous rebel groups was the Red Eyebrows. Yes, the Red Eyebrows. That is an excellent rebel name. Very clear branding. Apparently, they painted their eyebrows red so they could recognize each other. Simple, memorable. Much easier to understand than Wang Mang's currency system. Other rebel forces also rose. The countryside became unstable. Local power broke down. The Qin dynasty started losing control. Wang Mang kept trying to manage the crisis, but the crisis was bigger than the policies. This is one of the great lessons of his story. A government can be too late. A reformer can be too rigid. A solution can be morally attractive and practically disastrous at the same time. Wang Mang wanted to restore order by reaching back to an imagined ancient ideal. But people were not living in an ancient textbook. They were living in a collapsing economy with floods, hunger, soldiers, taxes, and confusing coins. You cannot feed a starving farmer with a beautifully named reform. You cannot stop a flood with ritual language. You cannot make people trust money by changing it until nobody knows what it is worth. Eventually, the rebellion reached the capital. In 23 AD Chang, and fell. Wang Mang was killed. His dynasty ended. The new dynasty was over. The new had become old very quickly. The Han dynasty would later be restored in a new form, known as the Eastern Han. Wang Mang's great experiment became a warning. Not because reform is always bad. That would be the wrong lesson. Sometimes systems really do need reform. The Western Han really did have serious problems. Land inequality was not imaginary. Elite power was not imaginary. Poor farmers were not pretending. The old house really did have cracks. The problem was that Wang Mang tried to repair the house by replacing the roof, the floor, the walls, the money, the labels, the social order, and several moral principles all at once, during a storm. While arguing that this was how the ancient sages would have done it. That is a lot. Even for a very organized man, especially for everyone else. For cartoon history, Wang Mang is perfect. Picture him standing in front of a giant empire-shaped machine. The machine is smoking. The gears are loose. Farmers are worried. Rich families are hoarding land. Officials are sweating. And Wang Mang walks in with a giant scroll labeled reforms. Then he pulls one lever. The money changes. He pulls another lever. The land system changes. Another lever. Market prices change. Another lever. Titles change. Another lever. Titles change. Another lever. Everyone screams. Then the Yellow River walks in and flips the table. That is the Wang Mang experience. He was not simply stupid. That is what makes him interesting. He was serious. He was learned. He saw genuine injustice. He wanted to build a more moral order, but he trusted plans more than conditions. He trusted ancient models more than messy reality. He trusted state commands more than people's ability to resist, evade, panic, and survive. A reform can fail because the reformer has bad goals. But a reform can also fail because the reformer thinks good goals are enough. They are not. Good intentions do not collect taxes. Good intentions do not stabilize currency. Good intentions do not persuade angry landowners to give up wealth. Good intentions do not rebuild trust after the government keeps changing the rules. Wang Mang's story is funny because the reforms became so much. It is tragic because the suffering was real. People lived through the confusion. People starved. People rebelled. People died. The state broke. And the man who wanted to fix everything became remembered as the man who fixed China until it broke. That is the final irony. Wang Mang called his dynasty new. He wanted renewal. He wanted moral restoration. He wanted ancient virtue in a broken age. But history does not reward a plan just because it sounds noble. History asks a meaner question. Can it actually work? For Wang Mang, the answer was no. Not enough trust. Not enough capacity. Not enough stability. Too many rules. Too many enemies. Too many disasters. Too many coins. Definitely too many coins. There is one more reason Wang Mang is such a useful warning. He reminds us that reform is not automatically wisdom. A plan can sound moral and still fail. A policy can identify a real problem and still make that problem worse. Wang Mang saw land inequality, elite power, debt, and suffering. Those were not fake issues. But he treated the empire like a document that could be corrected by editing the wording. Change the names. Change the coins. Change the rules. Change the official theory of society. Then expect millions of people to behave according to the new diagram. That is where his imagination outran his government. He had ideals, but not enough practical trust. He had commands, but not enough compliance. He had ancient models, but not enough attention to the desperate present. For ordinary people, the reforms were not elegant philosophical arguments. They were rules that affected land, money, taxes, food, and survival. If the coin in your hand stops making sense, your life gets worse immediately. If the land rule changes but local power does not, you may gain nothing except confusion. If officials enforce a beautiful idea badly, the result is still bad. That is why Wang Mang feels almost tragic. He was not a simple cartoon fool. Wang Mang's failure also shows the danger of confusing moral performance with actual repair. He wanted the state to look righteous. He wanted policies that sounded ancient, balanced, and fair. He wanted the language of virtue to cover the machinery of government. But people do not live inside slogans. They live inside prices, harvests, debts, roads, families, and hunger. If a reform sounds beautiful, but makes daily life harder, ordinary people will not praise its philosophical elegance. They will curse it while trying to buy grain. That is where Wang Mang lost the country. Not only in the palace, not only in policy debates. He lost it in the gap between what his reforms promised and what people experienced. That gap became anger. The collapse also exposes the difference between changing rules and changing power. Wang Mang could rename land, but powerful families still had influence. He could redesign money. But trust in money cannot be ordered into existence. He could announce fairness. But fairness needs enforcement that people believe in. That is why his reforms produce so much friction. He was trying to use the state to defeat entrenched interests while the state itself was already weak, distrusted, and under pressure. That is like trying to repair a bridge while it is already falling into the river. Wang Mang also shows how reform can become theater when it is too obsessed with appearing moral. He did not simply issue practical adjustments. He wrapped reform in the language of ancient virtue. He wanted his policies to look like a restoration of a golden age. That gave his rule a special kind of confidence. He was not merely changing taxes, he was correcting history. He was not merely changing land rules. He was reviving the proper order of society. He was not merely changing coins. He was announcing a new moral economy. That kind of language can be powerful. It can inspire people. It can also blind rulers to practical failure. If you believe your policy represents virtue itself, then anyone who resists may look selfish, corrupt, or backward. But resistance is not always proof that people hate virtue. Sometimes it is proof that the policy does not work. Wang Mang needed feedback. Instead, his system produced pressure. He needed trust. Instead, people saw confusion. He needed gradual repair. Instead, he created a storm of commands. That is why the episode should not mock him as merely stupid. The sharper point is that he was dangerously serious. A foolish ruler might break things by accident. Wang Mang broke things while holding a blueprint. That makes the story more interesting. It is not chaos versus order. It is one man's dream of perfect order producing chaos. The red eyebrows and other rebels were not just random troublemakers appearing for drama. They were symptoms. Symptoms that the countryside no longer trusted the center. Symptoms that economic confusion had become political anger. Symptoms that a government can lose legitimacy when its solutions feel like punishments. By the time armies and rebels were moving, the argument about ancient ideals no longer mattered much. Hungry people do not care how elegant the theory is. They care whether the system lets them live. That is the human layer the episode needs. Behind every reform category were people trying to survive. This is why Wang Mang should not be treated as just a funny man with too many coins. The coin problem is funny because it is easy to picture, but behind it is something more serious. A government only works when people believe its rules will still make sense tomorrow. Wang Mang kept changing the rules while asking people to trust him more. That is backwards. Trust usually has to come first. Then reform can survive difficulty. Without trust, every new policy looks like another threat. Every new coin looks like another trick. Every new moral slogan sounds like another reason ordinary people will pay the price. That is how reform becomes collapse. Not because change is evil. Because change without trust feels like chaos wearing official clothes. A farmer wondering what land rule applies now. A merchant wondering what coin still works. A local official wondering how to enforce another impossible order. A poor family wondering why the state keeps changing names while their food problem remains the same. That is where Wang Mang's grand plan broke down. Not in one debate. Not in one villain scene. In thousands of daily frustrations becoming one historical collapse. Then anger became rebellion. Then rebellion became the end of his dynasty. He was a serious man with huge ideas and a collapsing world underneath him. And sometimes serious men with huge ideas can be more dangerous than obvious fools. So remember Wang Mang, the reformer with giant plans, the man who saw real problems and built unreal solutions. The ruler who tried to drag an empire into an ancient ideal and discovered that the empire had other plans. He did not fail because nothing needed fixing. He failed because trying to fix everything at once can become its own disaster. Sometimes a government breaks because nobody changes anything. And sometimes it breaks because one man changes everything.